This video is sponsored by the Farmer's Dog. Deep beneath a forest in an undisclosed location outside of Moscow, red lights flickered to life. And along with them, a screeching alarm and an automated voice announcing,
Запуск обнаружен. Приближается ракета.
Stanislav Petrov, the duty officer that night in the secret Russian facility, stood frozen in disbelief for what probably felt like an eternity. In reality, it was barely enough time for the cold beads of sweat to begin forming as he quickly jumped into action and confirmed that the brand new Soviet satellite system had indicated one missile launch. Just as he confirmed the initial launch, another alarm sounded off indicating the United States had just launched another 4 missiles at Russia. Petrov's protocol was clear. Escalate this warning to the Kremlin. A counter-strike order would likely follow, unleashing thousands of warheads. But instead of escalating this early warning, Petrov took a minute to settle his nerves and force himself into analysis. The Oko Russian satellite system was brand new and not fully finished. I had a funny feeling in my gut. I didn't want to be the one responsible for starting World War III. It was his logical thinking in a moment of crisis that allowed him to consider how odd it was for a nuclear strike to only include 5 missiles and not hundreds. He then cross-checked the ground radars, which were still silent. After 5 minutes of analysis, he would later describe as endless. He broke protocol and decided to call it in as a false alarm, despite, as he described, having all the data to believe there was a missile attack. 23 minutes later, I realized that nothing had happened. If there had been a real strike, then I would already know about it. It was such a relief. History would later reveal the culprit, sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, which tricked the brand new satellite algorithm. That night, a single human judgment prevented global nuclear war. What's chilling is how familiar that night's sequence of blinking lights and computer warnings would have looked. Because only 3 months earlier, a Hollywood thriller had dramatized the same nightmare, and it scared a sitting US president into action. That movie was WarGames. The story of WarGames didn't start with glowing screens or nuclear countdowns or even about computers. It began quietly in 1979 when 2 young screenwriters, Walter Parkes and Lawrence Lasker, were trading ideas for stories in Los Angeles. A story that would slowly come together under the working title of The Genius was about a dying scientist and him finding his predecessor in a teenager who was the only other person that could understand his work. Lasker had been inspired by the predicament Stephen Hawking found himself in with progressive ALS, that one day he might figure out unified field theory and have no way of being able to tell anyone about it. While this set up the bare bones elements of the final story, the real star of the film wouldn't be discovered until they visited the Stanford Research Institute, where they met Peter Schwartz, the director of Strategic Environment Center, who would introduce them to the world of computers.
This is a Commodore home computer system. With it, you can learn music, take care of your household accounts, file your lists, type your letters, get into telecommunications, and entertain your family.
We were complete newbies in 1979. We didn't even know that home computers could hook up to other computers, Lasker would later say. Well, they landed at the right place for cutting-edge technology at the time, as SRI was literally node 2 of ARPANET, which was the direct ancestor of today's internet. When they went to SRI, they were essentially arriving at one of the world's first internet addresses. And it was here that Schwartz saw a new angle for the story.
And we described our story. And Peter thought for a second. He said, well, you've ever heard of computer games? He said, they're quite amazing, and you can really use some controls and cause things to happen on the screen, and you're in control of it.
Before our conversation, the Falcon character was just a way to access the adult side of the movie. It wasn't even much about computers yet, said Parkes. There was a subculture of extremely bright kids developing into what would become known as hackers, said Schwartz. Schwartz made the connection between youth, computers, gaming, and the military. And The Genius began its long morph into WarGames. But now with the story slowly turning into a bit of a film on military operations and hackers, the writing duo would eventually visit another location for research for the film.
The other big piece of the puzzle was an article written by a friend of mine from Yale named Ron Rosenbaum, and he had written a piece called The Underground World of the Bomb. And it talked about missile commanders with their keys and the whole simulations that they do for WarGames.
And what better place to go than Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, the location of the North American Aerospace Defense Command. It was from this facility that both American and Canadian military officials could react to any incoming Soviet threat, including nuclear weapons.
Every now and then, NORAD or SAC would invite people from Hollywood to check out what they were doing. I think we talked our way onto one of those pre-existing tours.
They flew us there on a C-130 transport, and we had a tour of the Crystal Palace.
During their visit, the commander-in-chief of NORAD, James Hardinger, got wind of their film and approached them as they were leaving, saying, "I understand you boys are writing a movie about me. Let's go to the bar." It was during this meeting that they would find inspiration for their character in the film for General Behringer, who in the film hated the introduction of machines and computers into the decision-making.
Gentlemen, we've had men in these silos since before any of you were watching Howdy Doody.
Hardinger loved the idea of focusing on that idea of machines taking over and said, "Goddamn, you're right. I sleep well at night knowing I'm in charge."
For myself, I sleep pretty well at night, knowing those boys are down there.
Initially, the two writers explored some more outlandish ideas of space-based defensive lasers and how a computer could take over them, but found that the ideas didn't seem to be as well grounded as they would have hoped for. They wanted this movie to feel like it was something that could actually happen, so they turned to that relatively new community of hackers.
I think WarGames was one of the first real movies to delve into a computer as it really works and to delve into hacker culture. But very few people actually knew what hackers did or how the actual apparatus and machinery they used worked.
They spoke with John Captain Crunch Draper, a phone freak legend who described scanning phone numbers to find hidden modems, the very process that would later become Lightman's dial-up montage.
What are you doing?
Dialing into the school's computer.
They would also consult with David Scott Lewis, a real teenage hacker who they would call up randomly with questions about computers, even asking a key question for the climax of the film. Can you get a computer to play games with itself? And he'd say, yes, number of players, 0.
Is there any way to make it play itself?
Yes, number of players 0.
This real-world research they did for the script would pay dividends later on and, oddly enough, offered a glimpse into a world of what could happen. So much so that it seemed government officials were not even fully aware of all of these connecting pieces. And perhaps this early research and commitment to keeping it grounded is what would make the sitting president take it more seriously than a film about space lasers. But we'll get into that story here in a second. First, they would have to get funding and make the film. By 1982, though, the screenplay had become way more ambitious than they had originally planned for.
So I started taking WarGames around to studios, and nobody seemed to get it. They didn't understand the technology. They said, "Is this science fiction?" I said, no, it's not science fiction. It's probably science fact.
Universal Pictures, who had originally agreed to fund the film, started to bristle at the idea of covering the scope and cost of building an authentic war room.
The only positive reception I got was at United Artists, MGM, and they said, okay, they would do it.
They would hire Martin Brest as the director, who would come in and change the character of Falcon, the scientist.
The studio was adamant that Marty was the director.
Marty was the flavor of the month then. He was a very hot young director.
I still wish we had been able to stick with the original dying astrophysicist character, said Lasker. It was Marty Brest who didn't like the idea of a man in a wheelchair in a war room because it was too much like Dr. Strangelove.
At the bottom of some of our deeper mine shafts, radioactivity would never penetrate a mine some thousands of feet deep.
With the script and funding settled, they could begin production on August 9th, 1982, but not without a hitch. Finding healthy food for your dog can be difficult. I get it. My dog Marshall has food allergies. Thankfully, today's sponsor, The Farmer's Dog, makes finding fresh, healthy food incredibly easy. All you have to do is take a quick quiz about your dog, their weight, age, activity level, and they ship everything right to your door. You get pre-portioned meals, a personalized feeding guide with your dog's name on every pack, plus a freezer bag and a reusable storage container for the fridge. They even include a transition guide to help your dog move from kibble to fresh food without any issues. We got Marshall started on their plan a few weeks ago, and he is absolutely loving it and still loving every bite. We can actually get him on a feeding schedule now, as he will eat all the food the second we put it down. Flexible orders with The Farmer's Dog means less stress and total peace of mind. Whether we're traveling or just busy at home, I honestly wish we had tried fresh sooner. The Farmer's Dog isn't just food, though. They're on a mission to help dogs live long, healthy lives, and they back it up with 24/7 customer support, personalized plans, and everything you need for confidence and convenience. Get 50% off your box of freshly made, healthy dog food by using my link. Plus, you get free shipping and 24/7 customer support. Click the link in the description below or scan scan the QR code. Now, let's get back to some AI. By the spring of 1982, the transformation from a quiet drama into a full-fledged techno-thriller was complete. Now the challenge was to make that world believable on film, but after 12 days of filming, they would run into issues with their director Martin Brest, who sort of had the wrong tone for the film, treating the material like a dark conspiracy thriller. And due to these creative differences, Martin Brest was dismissed and they would bring in director John Badham, who would immediately recognize the issue after viewing the footage they had already shot, saying, "I know what's wrong. They're not having fun."
I got a call from my agent saying, "Oh, there's a problem over at UA. And there's a film that they're not happy with and want you to read it, but I don't want you to do it." And I said, "You don't want me to do it?" He said, "Oh, no, this is nothing but trouble." And I said, "Yeah, but what if the script is good?" The whole film was just brilliantly prepared.
Whether or not that was the right decision, I guess, can be left up to personal preference, as some of the interesting aspects of this film, at least to me, get taken up by some pretty odd interactions.
You can go to jail for that.
Only if you're over 18.
Now, what was probably the most interesting production aspect of this film, and what made it feel so grounded, was its recreation of NORAD's command center, even though they had very limited information to work with on building it. Production designer Jeffrey Kirkland and his team decided to build their own version on a massive soundstage in Culver City, California, and the set was nothing short of spectacular.
The sets were built on the largest sound stages on the MGM lot, and the sets went wall to wall inside these stages. That was the main war room.
My understanding is the same soundstage where they built Munchkin Land and The Wizard of Oz. It was a wonderful set.
A 3-story wall of glowing maps and missile trajectories dominated the space, flanked by banks of consoles and blinking indicator lights. The sheer size of it allowed all the cameras to move fluidly, giving the final film a documentary realism and a sense of scale that no matte painting could match. Even US Air Force officers who would later visit the set were impressed, saying, "If it can really look like this, why doesn't ours?" In fact, the NORAD they built for the film was far superior to the actual NORAD command center at the time, as they still relied on old 1950s computers and it was less visually impressive than in the film. At the time, Cheyenne Mountain's Combat Operations Center used large rear projection boards and mechanical light maps to track missiles or bomber routes. They were impressive, but they didn't have the vivid, glowing, full-motion computer graphics that the movie showcased.
WarGames was interesting. It was produced, in the early 80s, and at that time, all visual effects were generated optically and composited optically, and we had the task of creating a war room that had 12 giant screens, unlike any giant screens anybody had ever seen before. And of course, those kinds of screens didn't exist.
So, how did the production team pull this effect off? Well, the team wanted those wall displays to feel alive, not like static art or maybe paintings. Instead of adding the visuals in post-production, they decided to film the screens in camera.
That meant there were these huge film projectors at the back of the stage and at the front of the stage going in both directions. And they all had to be running in sync with each other. There were also 84 video monitors, which all had to be in dead sync.
Hewlett-Packard HP 9845C computers and HP 1345A vector displays drove custom animations of missile launches, countdown clocks, and world maps. Each frame of animation was photographed through color filters to create rich, layered motion. Over the course of 7 months, the crew would produce more than 50,000 feet of negative, so that every glowing line the audience saw in theaters was real light captured on film.
We had to build a strobe system that was the brightest, most powerful 24 frame per second strobe system on the planet at the time. It was an amazing confluence of a lot of emerging technologies.
It's interesting how many films in this era inspired a lot of design elements of the future. Though I don't think it's much of a surprise that government agencies aren't really thinking about how to make something look cool until someone shows them how to do it.
This is Mr. Richter. Paul, would you like to tell these gentlemen about the Whopper?
Well, the Whopper spends all its time thinking about World War III.
On June 6, 1983, WarGames opened in theaters across America. Audiences came for the thrill of a teenage hacker outsmarting the military, and then left with the uneasy sense that the machines keeping nuclear peace might not know the difference between a game and reality. Enter President Ronald Reagan. Reagan was an avid film buff, having been a long-running actor before his political career. And on the opening weekend of WarGames, he decided to sit down and watch it in a screening at the Camp David homestead. This movie night left him, shall we say, unnerved. Days later, during a meeting with members of Congress about the MX missile program, Reagan suddenly pivoted away from briefing papers. Had anyone seen this new movie, WarGames, he asked, before narrating the plot himself. When a lawmaker warned him not to give away the ending, Reagan smiled and pressed on. His question at the end of the summary caught everyone off guard. Could something like this really happen? Reagan was a leader who had prided himself on ratcheting up the tensions in the Cold War, selling it as a battle of good versus evil.
To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
Tangling the country in more wars like Nicaragua and Afghanistan, and investing in new technology to try and win it. But with his reasoning, he suddenly realized that his fancy equipment had a gaping security hole in it. That opened the door to all sorts of anxieties, like an overconfident teenager like David in the movie. Potentially creating complications in the works was one thing, but what if these loopholes could be exploited by more malicious players, real foreign adversaries, stealing key data, sabotaging networks, or worse, actually hijacking weapon systems like in the film? With this in mind, Reagan ordered a full national security review. Within a week, the Joint Chiefs of Staff returned an answer. Yes, the premise was technically possible. This led to the creation of the NSDD-145, a national directive on computer security, largely influenced by WarGames. Issued in 1984, it aimed at increasing cybersecurity practices and tightening the distribution of certain technical manuals that could be useful to foreign hackers, assigning the NSA as the national manager for telecommunications and automated information system security. Then in 1986, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was passed, criminalizing unauthorized access to computer systems used by the government and, in some cases, the commercial sector. It also criminalized online fraud and extortion attempts. While the bill was being created by the House of Representatives, it specifically cited WarGames as a realistic interpretation of the access capabilities of a computer. Essentially, the ability to remotely access sensitive software.
I don't know. They're trajectory headings for multiple impact re-entry vehicles.
This is what actually made essentially hacking a crime in itself, which just wasn't a concept back then, which is something you actually see in the film, where David is threatened with espionage charges instead, even though he's obviously not some kind of spy.
I'll be escorting you to federal authorities in Denver, where you'll be placed under arrest pending indictment for espionage.
Espionage? No, wait a minute. Let me talk to him. He's right over there.
The NSDD-145 was later overturned in 1987, though, by the Computer Security Act, an initiative Congressman Jack Brooks, who felt the directive went too far in giving the NSA sweeping oversight over civilian issues, handing much of that power to the National Bureau of Standards, now known as the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. This was possibly the first in a very long list of anxieties over government tech overreach that would continue to this day. Technology regulation has gone through all sorts of twists and turns since then, of course, but WarGames has a unique place in bringing real attention to the internet, bringing it out of the pure Wild West age it was in for the first decade. For better or worse, an age when the growth of technology and its capabilities was only really talked about in select circles. It even changed how Hollywood portrayed hackers, from terrorists to misunderstood geniuses. Rather than focusing on hypothetical destructive power of technology, WarGames presented David as a clever kid who didn't know what he was getting into, someone very sympathetic, who, despite making a big mess, ultimately cleans it up and manages to expose the flaws of the automated system, a little like the white hat hackers of today. Now, it's very strange that a teen hacker film led by Matthew Broderick, complete with a sarcastic AI and tic-tac-toe, helps push national security reform, but sometimes media can have that heavy of an impact, and I think we saw that in the first story that we told before we even got into this film. Real-life examples of how similar situations could happen. Another nuclear war film, The Day After, showing the terror of a post-apocalyptic world, dramatically impacted Ronald Reagan as well, and pushed him towards disarmament talks. History is a whole jumble of factors, but in a small way, Hollywood helped inspire the end of the Cold War. If you enjoyed this video on the production of WarGames and its real-world impact, you'll love our video on the massive world they created inside a studio, right here.